Okay, the second D that I think we're facing today is despair. It's very real. It's very everywhere. I was at a conference 2 summers ago of 150 scientists meeting on an island off of New Hampshire. They've been meeting for 62 years. The Institute of Religion and Science, I think they call themselves, IRAS. And they asked me to come and give a talk on the Pope's encyclical Laudate Si on the environment. And I wasn't up till Wednesday, so I arrived on a Sunday, so I hung around, of course, and listened to people and picked up stories and all the rest. When it came my time to talk Wednesday morning, I stood up and I said, I'm not going to talk about what you invited me to talk about. The Pope's encyclical, I've written a good essay on it. It's on my webpage. It's free. Go there. I'm going to talk about what's going on here. By the way, a word about that encyclical. It was written by one of my students, a graduate of our master's program, Sean McDonough, an Irish priest, missionary in the Philippines. He went through our master's program, then went back to the Philippines, started to write short books on spirituality and ecology, which Pope Francis obviously heard about. So he picked them up from the Philippines and plucked them to Rome and said, write it. So 80% of that encyclical was written by a student of mine, and 15% by a friend of mine and yours, Leonardo Boff. And the Pope gets about 5%. But what's interesting about that story is that I've lived so long that for 34 years, 2 popes called my work, quote, dangerous and deviant. And now we have a pope who's plagiarizing it. So you got to keep a sense of humor. And so I've lived a full life. I've lived a full life. But what I wanted to talk about then was despair, because that is what I had picked up from these scientists it would have been 2016. And these are some of the things I said about despair. Thomas Aquinas says that despair is the most dangerous of all sins. It's not the worst. Injustice is the worst. But despair is the most dangerous, he says, because when people are in despair, they don't care about themselves. And they certainly no longer care about one another. He says the worst thing an adult can do is to teach despair. Wow. Because I think our media are teaching despair. And the mother of despair, if you will, or the father, is fear. Fear is what births despair. Since 9/11, our whole culture has been swimming in fear, and it's now come to the point of despair. Now, we should remember that this apocalyptic time in which we do find ourselves, because climate change is real and so much else is real that is thoroughly dangerous. This apocalyptic time, we should remember that the word apocalypse also means revelation. A breakdown of everything, the chaos we find ourselves in, can also be a breakthrough. And I think this is what Ilya is teaching in her books, and it's certainly what I've been about for 45 years. That it's time for a breakthrough. It's not about band-aiding what we had, whether in religion or education or politics or economics. This is an invitation to become more fully human. That is the bottom line today. It's not about how do I become the perfect Christian, the perfect Buddhist, the perfect atheist. It's about what does it mean to be human? Howard Thurman, one of my very favorite mystics, who is how many of you know Howard Thurman? Good, because he's a Floridian. He was born here in Florida, one of the great mystics of North America. He was the spiritual genius behind the civil rights movement. When King was stabbed in 1958 in a book signing in New York City and the knife missed his aorta by 1/4 of an inch, he invited one person to his bedside, and that was Howard Thurman. Every time King went to jail, which was 39 times, he had one book with him, Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited. One of Howard Thurman's favorite phrases, which he uses often, is, that we become stripped of our literal selves before God. We stand stripped of our literal selves before God. I think that is what is happening globally today with our species. We are in a collective dark night of our species. Rabbi Heschel said years ago, don't just talk about the dark night of the soul, talk about the dark night of society. And I say yes, and now it's time to talk about the dark night of our species. Now, the mystics tell us about the dark night. It's a very powerful place to be. You don't run from it. You don't go shopping. You don't do drugs, alcohol, or get addicted out on TV and football and golfing and all the other trinkets that a culture offers us. You stay with the darkness. What does it have to teach us? Ask it that. What does despair have to teach me? Because despair in itself is not always a bad thing. Father B. Griffiths, a wonderful monk who lived 50 years in ashram in southern India, he says despair can be a yoga. Many people do not experience spirit or God until they go through a breakdown, a despairing time. Despair can be a yoga. Think of AA, for example. How many people I've met in AA whose spiritual life opened up after they had bottomed. So despair is not the last word. But when it's floating around everywhere, we've got to name it because all of us will be affected by it. So what is some of the medicine for despair? Well, there's a wonderful definition of hope from David Orr, the eco-philosopher. He says, hope is a verb with the sleeves rolled up. I really like that. Hope is a verb with the sleeves rolled up. My hope is proportionate to the work people are doing, the inner work and the outer work. The people, the rise of women in our time, running for office and demanding common sense and the rest, and the rise of women even in the churches, even in the Roman Catholic Church here. I know there are some representatives here of the women priest movement. And of course, Noreen is one of them. I so salute that. There are women who will not take no for an answer. And that's part of the sign of hope in our time. So the solution to despair is inner work that results in outer work. So that rolling up your sleeves, that has to do with our inner work as well as our outer work. There's this brilliant sentence from Rabbi Heschel, who has so many, one of the great minds and spirits of the 20th century. He says, the idea with which Judaism starts is not the realness of evil or the sinfulness of man, but rather the wonder of creation. The wonder of creation. That's the via positiva of the mystics. And the ability of humans to do the will of God. This is why despair is alien to Jewish faith. Despair is alien to Jewish faith. It has no place in the tradition from which Jesus comes and which he was boiling down into the best of its teachings. Despair is alien to Jewish faith, therefore alien to Jesus' faith. Part of our work is to identify where despair is coming at us so strongly and why. One reason it comes from Otto Rank, the brilliant psychologist of the 20th century. I love his work, R-A-N-K, Otto Rank. He broke with Freud over the issue of creativity. And he says that pessimism comes from a repression of creativity. Pessimism comes from the repression of creativity. Where creativity is being repressed, there is going to arise pessimism. And of course, patriarchy, by definition, is out killing creativity. It's mostly frightened by creativity. check out the Taliban, the Vatican, and Pat Robinson. They've all been busy for the last 2 decades, or 3 decades, although this papacy is a little different, but they've all been very busy in controlling the feminine. Carl Jung says that creativity comes from the realm of the mothers, the realms of the mothers. So where the mothers and the grandmothers and the feminine in general is being repressed, you can sure there will be creativity and there will be pessimism. Patriarchy is radically pessimistic. So much so that Adrienne Rich, one of my favorite feminist writers, says that there is a fatalistic self-hatred in men. Fatalistic self-hatred. This is taught by our culture. It's the matrix. Instead of a divine milieu, we have a patriarchal milieu. And we're all breathing this poison toxic into us, men and women, day and night, children, and it's coming in the media at us, comes out in pulpits, in classrooms, and political speeches, and all the rest. So we have to stand up to it. It helps to name it so we can stand up to it. Despair and patriarchy, they go together. And so does the modern era, because the modern era was radically patriarchal. Let me share with you an amazing passage from a wonderful writer, whom I'm sure many of you know, Barbara Ehrenreich. Her brilliant book on ritual, history of ritual. She makes this point, that there was an epidemic of depression in the 17th century. It hit the European world, and it culminated in a rash of suicides. An anxious self, she says, emerged that transformed the individual into a kind of walled fortress, carefully defended from everyone else. Part of the rise of individualism. Now, my telling the story of when religion and science split goes something like this, a quick version. It's a little bit different from Ilya's reading, and that's fine. But my way of putting it is this. The key year was 1600. In the year 1600, the Catholic Church burned Giordano Bruno at the stake. They didn't just burn him, they cut his tongue out and tortured him for weeks. But then they burned him. Who was Giordano Bruno? He was a Dominican brother of mine, and Eckhart and Aquinas, and he was burned because he was trying to take the new Copernican science into theology. And that was a nice result, wasn't it? So this is my telling of the story, and it is a story. The scientists said, oh, these believers, they can be scary. You know, let's work a truce. Let's work a truce. Why don't you believers take the soul, and we'll take the cosmos? Oh, goody, goody, said all these Augustinian-tainted Christians. Because who needs nature anyway? It's all fallen. And as Augustine says, and I quote, spirit is whatever is not matter, unquote. The most radical dualistic statement ever uttered by a two-legged one. In contrast, my brother Aquinas, who had the balls to take him on, but subtly, said, and I quote, spirit is the elan in everything. That's like M equals, energy equals MC squared. It's combining things. There's spirit in everything. The spirit of a horse, the spirit of grass, the energy of the grass. It's all spirit. So the movement of non-dualism is precisely this tradition that I call creation spirituality. Not just I, but my mentor, Père Chanou. But the point is that I think that's how religion and science split. And what happened is, of course, science became more and more powerful, but with very little conscience. So it's selling its soul in the 20th century to all kinds of chemical corporations and all the rest, denuding the planet. And on the one hand, then religion became more and more silly, cut off from the cosmos, more and more introspective and utterly silly. And you have to read some theologians. I don't recommend it, but read some 19th century and early 20th century theologians to get how ridiculous it was. Like nuns who were chastised for undressing and we're supposed to wear gloves in the bathtub, and oh my God, I mean, it's too much. It's just too much. But you can see why the whole culture got depressed and started committing suicide when the human, Aquinas says, every human being is capax universi, capable of the universe. And yet we got cut off from the universe because science and religion split. Not only split, but religion did a violent thing to science. It wasn't just Galileo. It was Bruno and others. So here's a picture of 16th century Protestantism. Here's John Calvin. Life in this world is totally wretched. Nowhere is happiness to be found. No matter where we look, high or low, we can see only a curse that spreading over all creatures and embracing the earth and the sky ought to burden our souls with horrible despair. Oh, I need a drink. Woo! This is a launching of the modern religious era, folks. It was launched in patriarchal pessimism. And here is Luther. Despair totally of themselves. People ought to despair totally of themselves in order to be able to receive Christ's grace. Having grown into receiving Christ's grace, having grown into a bad tree, man can only want and do evil. Well, this is what I would call original despair. As one French historian, Jean Delumeau, puts it, the fear of God and a new fear was born in the 17th century. The dread of God, the fear of oneself emerged with this excessive sense of guilt and culpability. That marked that century. And it was not a happy time. But it is the basis of modern consciousness. And of course, that is part of the good news of today, that we're moving out of the modern consciousness. But it does help, I think, to name it. And there are many movements toward hope. And I would just like to name a few. I don't have time to go into them, but I don't want to leave you hanging with Calvin and Luther's darkest days. But don't underestimate how that attitude has permeated our culture. Calvin has been called the father of modern capitalism, the philosopher behind modern capitalism, the religion behind modern capitalism. To prove your worth, to prove you're saved, you got to gobble all this stuff up. And so even if you're not a believer or even a Presbyterian, in fact, a number of years ago, I quoted Calvin and some other passages were even more dreary in a Presbyterian church in Pittsburgh. And afterwards, the pastor came up to me and said, that's the first time Calvin has been quoted in this church in 10 years. And I just ran into this fellow 2 weeks ago. I hadn't seen him in 22 years. We both remembered that moment. But again, we laugh about it, and we should, but we also realize that this is the origin. Patriarchy gives us pessimism, and that is one sign of hope in our time, that women are rising. And the divine feminine is being called forward again. And the goddess is back, and she's pissed. And and she has a right to be. Mother Earth is being raped. Just like the UNOBUF says. She's being treated the way the poor are being treated. And that's what climate change denial is doing. We're not playing around here. And this whole immigration thing, you know what never makes the news? The media is complicit in most of this stuff. For example, in the last presidential election, I don't remember one media interview of the candidates when they were on stage together that asked about climate change or the environment. Total anthropocentrism, which Pope Francis has correctly called narcissism. The narcissism of our species is everywhere. But there are many signs of hope. The return of the divine feminine is one. And detox the bad masculine. In my book, which this quote was from, Hidden Spirituality of Men, 10 Metaphors to Awaken the Sacred Masculine, I end it with the 2 chapters on the sacred marriage, the divine feminine and the sacred masculine. But to get there, women have been liberating themselves for my whole lifetime, and I've been cheering them on. And 2 popes didn't like that. But the men are way behind. The first response I got to this book was from a woman. She emailed me and she said, I have over 220 books in my personal library on the goddess, the divine feminine, and I've spent the last 40 years bringing that back to my awareness and consciousness. I don't regret it for a minute. But she said, I have 2 teenage boys, and until I read your book, I didn't realize how much men have suffered under patriarchy. She said, you are right. The next phase of feminism has to be all of us working on cleaning up the masculine. And that's why I offered these 10 archetypes. Now, one response I got, I was at a conference, and this tall, elegant African-American came up to me, long white hair. He said, I've been working in prisons for 12 years. He said, men in prisons are always projecting on others. They don't want to look inside. For 12 years, I've been looking for a book that would get the men to look inside. Yours is the first book that did that. Because, see, I'm dealing with archetypes, Father Sky, Green Man, Blue Man, Hunter-Gatherer, Spiritual Warrior, and so forth. And these get to people. That's what an archetype is, by definition. It lights a fire inside. And he said to me, getting them into your book and looking inwards, they are finding the nobility inside. That, my friends, is key to understanding patriarchy. Men, too, have had their nobility ripped away. And of course, an original sin ideology absolutely contributes to that. Absolutely contributes to it. And you don't have to be a religious person to have been affected by original sin ideology. I think consumer capitalism is built on original sin ideology. You don't have what it takes. So you got to buy this, and then you buy this, and buy that, and the new model, and it's outside redemption. You have to buy your way out. So our culture has been permeated religiously, philosophically, and economically by original sin ideology. And I'll tell you one quick story. There's an amazing African-American in my city where I lived for 34 years, Oakland, who runs the biggest African-American church in town, Allen Temple. And he's the senior there. Years ago, when I was most in trouble with the Vatican, the BBC came to interview this guy, came to interview me and then interview him about me. And he said to the BBC, he said, this is a black pastor, he said, Matt is so far ahead of the church confuses him with the enemy. But he came to lecture in our program, our master's program. I remember I'll never forget how his lecture began. He held up my book, Original Blessing, and he said this, he said, my people need this more than they need jobs. Because what slavery did to us most deeply is to take away our dignity. See, to take away that nobility that this Native Americans spoke about that is missing in men all over our culture. Women too, but the women have been gathering in circles and fighting back for 50 years. There are many other movements of hope in our time, and I hope we can talk about them. I'm sure we will before the weekend's over. So I'm just going to stop there with that little list.